Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Park Community Church. For those of you I haven't met, my name's Trevor. I serve as one of the pastors here in the Center region, and it is good to be with you all this morning. So if you would, go ahead and grab a Bible and open up to the book of Acts, chapter 12, or if you're working on a device, go ahead and navigate to the book of Acts, chapter 12. That's where we'll be hanging out this morning, so looking forward to it. You might remember from a couple of weeks ago, I actually mentioned that we were going to be skipping this exact passage, and little did I know there would be an adjustment to our teaching schedule, and we're going to spend our time covering that this morning, so looking forward to it. It's a rich passage, so excited about that. And speaking of that phrase, little did I know, or little did he know, the movie Stranger Than Fiction, in which Will Ferrell plays the leading role, the leading character of Harold Crick, who's an IRS agent who, at the beginning, his life's kind of plain Jane, vanilla, maybe lacking in vitality a little bit. It makes such great use of that line, little did he know. As the story begins to progress, his life gains some excitement as he begins to hear the voice of an author narrating different aspects of his life. And at first, the material is just kind of mundane, right? As the narrator's explaining what he's thinking about as he brushes his teeth in the morning, nothing too exciting. But then everything changes one evening as he's waiting for the bus and he readjusts the time on his watch. And then the narrator goes on to say that particular phrase, little did he know, to describe how that simple act of changing the time on his watch would lead to his soon and impending death. And all of a sudden he knows that he's about to die, but he doesn't know how, doesn't know when, he just knows that it's coming quick, it's impending, right? And as you can imagine, this causes quite a disturbance for Harold. And throughout the rest of the movie, he's trying to figure out who is the person on the other side of this voice, and is there any way that I can stop this, right? That sets in motion the rest of the film. But the thing that I find fascinating about it is how, for Harold Crick, the recognition of the presence and the reality of an author in his life changed everything. The realization that someone was writing the story that he was living in. And that's a significant idea, not just for his character in the story, but I would make the claim also for you and I. Because whether or not we make the same recognition, I would say that the same is true of us, that there is an author to our stories who is outside of us. And when we make that recognition of the presence and the reality of an author in our lives, it changes everything. It alters our experience of the story, of our lives, drastically. And I mention that because the passage today, I believe it's trying to bring about that exact same realization. So much so that if I was to break it down into just one main idea, just a single point, this is what it would be. Remember who's writing the story. Remember who's writing the story. I think that's what it's trying to communicate to us. And so as we're working through the passage, we'll be exploring this idea in connection with it, to remember who's writing the story. And as we do, we have a table of contents for the blessed souls among us who are taking notes. And we have these 3 points. We have a rescue, an impression, and a judgment. A rescue, an impression, and a judgment. That's where we're going this morning, through those 3. So with that, we'll go ahead and jump into the first point now, a rescue. A rescue. So let's pick this up with verse 1 of chapter 12. About that time, Herod the king laid violent hands on some who belonged to the church. He killed James, the brother of John, with the sword. Okay, let's pause right there. So throughout the New Testament, we actually come across quite a few different Herods. The original one being Herod the Great, who we see in Matthew chapter 2. He's kind of the original King Herod, who's reigning at the time of Jesus' birth. This Herod in our passage is the grandson of that original one, who reigned from the early to the mid-40s over all of Israel under the authority of the Roman Empire. And what we see here is that his reign included a particularly violent treatment of the church. And that here he even takes one of the leaders, one of the 12 apostles, James, the brother of John who went on to write the Gospel of John and 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. He takes this James and has him executed. He has him publicly killed with the sword in probably a shameful and a humiliating fashion. And this probably dealt a pretty significant blow to the church in terms of hope and morale, that he just kills them, and we don't even get the reason why. It just kind of seems to be on a whim. But then to make matters worse, he follows it up with this. If you look with me at verse 3. And when he saw that it pleased the Jews, he proceeded to arrest Peter also. His aim now being not just to arrest and execute one of the leaders, but to execute the leader of the church in Jerusalem. This was during the days of unleavened bread. And when he had seized him, he put him in prison, delivering him over to 4 squads of soldiers to guard him, intending after the Passover to bring him out to the people for execution. So Peter was kept in prison, but earnest prayer for him was made to God by the church. So Herod notices that his execution of James wins him favor with the Jewish masses in Jerusalem, which is something that he wants, right? That's good for him. And so he decides to follow up that act with an even greater one by arresting and publicly executing Peter, right? The primary leader of the church in Jerusalem. But he arrests him right in the middle of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, a 7-day Jewish feast that begins with the Passover meal. And these days, these 7 days of the feast were considered holy. And so to stage a public execution in the midst of them would be considered sacrilegious. And so at least throughout this feast, throughout these days, Peter is safe. But Herod has him under lock and key, being guarded by 4 squads of 4 soldiers each, effectively eliminating any possibility of escape. And so it seems Peter's fate is sealed. But then Luke includes this note right at the close of the setup, that earnest prayer was being made on Peter's behalf by the church. It's almost like a clue that for all of the security and the contingencies of Herod's plan, there's still one person that he's failed to factor into the equation that might cause some disruption for him. Verse 6. Now, when Herod was about to bring him out, right, meaning the feast is finally over the next morning, he's going to bring him out for public execution. The night before, on that very night, Peter was sleeping between 2 soldiers, bound with 2 chains, and sentries before the door were guarding the prison. So he's chained to a guard on either side, and then there's 2 more soldiers guarding the doors. And behold, an angel of the Lord stood next to him, and a light shone in the cell. He struck Peter on the side and woke him, saying, "Get up quickly." And the chains fell off his hands. And the angel said to him, "Dress yourself and put on your sandals." And he did so. And he said to him, "Wrap your cloak around you and follow me." And he went out and followed him. He did not know what was being done by the angel was real, but thought he was seeing a vision. So Peter goes to sleep that night, chained to 2 different guards and being guarded by an additional 2 more. And he's thinking, there's no possibility of an escape here. I'm about to meet my end. When morning comes, this is it. But then, little did he know, the author of his story had other plans. As in the middle of the night, he gets struck in the side, woken up by this angel who tells him to basically get up and follow me. And together, they walk out right past the guards. But the thing is, everything that Peter's experiencing feels so far-fetched that he himself, who's living it, doesn't even believe it's real. He thinks it's some kind of dream or a vision until finally he comes to his senses. Verse 10, we'll pick up the second half of this. When they had passed the first and the second guard, they came to the iron gate leading into the city. It opened for them of its own accord, and immediately the angel left him. And finally, Peter comes to himself, and he says to himself, "Now I am sure that the Lord has sent his angel and rescued me from the hand of Herod and from all that the Jewish people were expecting. It's not a dream. I'm actually free." And so just to recap, right, Peter was being guarded by 4 squads of 4 soldiers, most likely working in a 3-hour rotation just to ensure their alertness and their attention to detail and that they're not falling asleep. And it's in the midst of these impossible circumstances, while he's chained to 2 of them, 2 more are watching the door, that Luke inserts the word "behold," meaning get ready, pay attention, you're not going to want to miss this. As somehow, simultaneously, all 4 of the guards fall asleep at once, or they're blinded to reality, or somehow they have no understanding of what's actually taking place. And the angel wakes Peter up, the chains fall off, and the angel says to him, "Get up, get dressed, and follow me." And together, they walk right out, past the guards, through the doors, and even beyond the massive iron gate that leads into the city. But it's not until they've walked out and even down the street a ways and the angel finally leaves him that he realizes this is actually happening. This is reality. 5 minutes ago, I was chained and awaiting my near and imminent death and my certain death. And yet now I'm standing here on the streets of Jerusalem in the middle of the night and I'm free. What is going on? And the question I want to ask is, have you ever found yourself in similar circumstances? Not necessarily in all of the details of the centuries in prison and the midnight angelic deliverance, but in the sense of a situation that seemed hopeless, where it seemed like there was no way through. But then little did you know, God had other plans. I still remember a few years back being in my final year of seminary, and which was kind of a long road for us. We were there for 5 years, right? And I remember knowing that graduation was coming, and there's kind of this excitement to bring one chapter of life to a close and to kind of embark on this next phase of life, this new chapter, right? And so early in the year, my wife and I, we started the job search, and January started applying to all these different positions, looking to see what was out there, trying to figure out, what does God have for us in this next season of life? And early on, it was exciting, because we're like, I've got this education, I've got some experience, was doing a residency program, got some good references. This is going to work out fine. This is exciting. And then a little bit of time went by, and we're exploring the options, and the pack begins to thin a little bit, and the options sort of narrow and dwindle, and then a little bit more time goes by, and the pack continues to thin, and all of a sudden it's not January anymore, and graduation isn't far off. Graduation is right on our doorstep. But it's okay, because there's still a few options, right? And what it's narrowed to, they're good options. They're ones that we're wanting to pursue and explore. And we're just thinking, what does God have for us? It's got to be one of these. And then you fast forward another couple of months, and all of a sudden it's midsummer, and graduation has passed, and the pack has continued to dwindle, and all of a sudden we find ourselves in a place where there's 3 weeks left of my on-campus job, at the close of which we need to move out of our apartment to make room for incoming students, right? And the pack has narrowed to such a degree that there's only a single option left. But it was a good one. It was one that we were excited about, and we were sure that this is what God has for us, right? We're pretty far in the process. It's only me and one other candidate, and I'm interviewing, and things are looking good, and I'm already working within the department. And so it feels like everything's going to work out, right? And God has us. Until one morning in early July, I come into the office to find that the job had been given to the other candidate, and that I didn't get it. And I can still remember going to my desk afterwards and just kind of sinking into the chair as our situation, the reality of it, kind of dawned on me that all of a sudden, right, at the close of 7 months of searching for a job, at the close of a year-long residency program and internships and all these things, at the end of 5 years of somewhat grueling education with a couple of kiddos along the way, we had no options. Not a single prospect, not a single door with even a crack in it. And we had 3 weeks left in our apartment. And I'm married with 2 kids. And I'm thinking, God, what are we supposed to do? Right? There was all these options. Surely you could have picked one of them, right? Why are we here? What are we supposed to do? I thought you had us. It's a situation, it's the kind of moment that just feels hopeless. And yet, little did I know, the entire time, God had something else in the works. Because about an hour and a half after I received the news that I didn't get that other role, my phone rang. And I picked up to find that it was our old senior pastor here, and he was calling to see if I could come in the next morning to meet with him to talk about my future at Park. And that was the offer that led to the role that I'm in now. And just like that, everything was good. And a door that we had no idea was even there opened. What stories like this reveal to us is that when a situation seems hopeless, it often seems that way only because we're failing to remember something or someone. We're failing to remember who's writing the story. Because no matter how bleak or how dire a situation seems, with God, there is always a way through. All right, with that, let's move into the second point now, an impression. So tracking back with the story, Peter, he's just been rescued from prison, the realization dawning on him that hey, I'm rescued, but I'm still on the streets of Jerusalem where I'm very much a wanted man, and I need to do something, right? I can't just stay here. And so this is what he does. If you look with me at verse 12. When he realized this, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose other name was Mark, John Mark, who goes on to be a pretty important player in the missionary journeys of Paul and Barnabas. So Peter makes way for the house of his mother, Mary, where many were gathered together and were praying. And when he knocked at the door of the gateway, a servant girl named Rhoda came to answer. Recognizing Peter's voice, in her joy, she did not open the gate, but ran in and reported that Peter was standing at the gate. So Peter makes way for the home of Mary, who probably was fairly wealthy, that she had a servant and also a home that was large enough for a gathering of people. And this is where the church, or at least several of them, are gathered praying for Peter. And so he makes way here, and he's knocking on the door, and Rhoda comes to answer. But when she does, she hears his voice, and she recognizes him before she actually opens the door. And just that recognition, just hearing his voice, fills her with so much joy that she forgets entirely about actually opening the door. And so instead, she goes back inside, rushing in to tell everyone, hey, Peter is standing outside of the door. And this is their response, verse 15. They said to her, "You are out of your mind." But she kept insisting that it was so. And they kept saying, "It is his angel." So, quick word on the angel there. The Greek word from the New Testament that gets translated into angel can also be translated messenger. Those are the two meanings that the word holds. And so either they're saying it's his messenger come from prison, or it's his angel. It's sort of a guardian personal angel that for some reason would sound like him, that there would be a mistake there. But either way, they find the idea that it's actually Peter standing on the other side of the door absolutely ridiculous. And then this is what happens, verse 16. So they're inside fighting, and it says this, "But Peter continued knocking." I love that part. And when they opened, they saw him and were amazed. But motioning to them with his hand to be silent, he described to them how the Lord had brought him out of prison. And he said, "Tell these things to James and to the brothers." Then he departed and went to another place. All right, so finally they decide to end their debate just by opening up the door to see who's actually on the other side. And when they do, they see Peter standing there. And they're shocked. They're astounded. They are amazed. And there's quite a bit of chatter in the room that follows. And so Peter has to silence them before he can go on to describe how God just rescued him from prison in this incredible and remarkable way. And then after that, he tells them, he gives them the instructions to go and tell this to James, who is obviously not the James who was just killed, James the brother of John, but this is James, who is the younger brother of Jesus, the son of Mary and Joseph the carpenter, who after this goes on to become the new primary leader of the church in Jerusalem, as we see later on, like in chapter 15, for example. We'll see that, him come to the fore there. But then after this, Peter, he leaves. He's still a wanted man in Jerusalem, and so he flees and goes into hiding. And Luke doesn't even say where. He just says that that he departed and went to another place. And that's how Peter escapes. And there's such a comic nature to this story that Peter has just experienced this incredible and this angelic rescue, only to find himself standing on the streets of Jerusalem knocking on the door of the believers, right? The one place that's actually safe for him in the city. And yet they're too busy inside quarreling and arguing about whether or not it's actually him to open the door and let him in. And I wonder if you just put yourself in his shoes, you can imagine how he would be frustrated and maybe in disbelief to some extent. But I also wonder, especially with the way this is recorded, if he wasn't in some ways laughing. Or at least looking back on this, if he didn't come to appreciate the humor of the moment. That this is like a moment of comic relief in the midst of a story that is otherwise very much dire. And I wonder if the memory of this moment, if it went on to kind of impress itself upon Peter in such a way that it led him to remember always who's writing the story. That this was like a divine joke with God emphasizing to Peter through humor that I can orchestrate things in whatever way that I want. And I'm showing you that now so that you'll remember always that it's me who's writing your story. That it's me. And that's a significant idea for us to grasp because it's the recognition of the presence and the reality of an author in our lives that changes everything. It changes the experience for us of so much of life. Because the good moments of life, right, like when you get to enjoy a sunset or a day at the beach or a triumph at work or even just some simple time with family, we begin to see these things as gifts from God because he's the one who created every sunset and who gave us these relationships and the ability to enjoy all of these things. And he's woven them into our story for our joy. He wants us to enjoy them. And when we come to this understanding, it gives us the ability to see every one of these memories and these experiences as an avenue for connection with our God. And in the same vein, even the difficult pieces of life, even the pain and the hardship and the suffering that we go through, it's not that they cease to become painful, but we're given the ability to persevere through because we know that our suffering isn't meaningless, but that God is doing something in it. And that one day when we see the entirety of the story, we'll know exactly what was happening and we'll understand. Right? And now that's, in addition to that, I feel like it can help guard us. Sometimes we can find ourselves, I don't know where you're at this morning. Maybe you walked in this morning and you're at a place where you look at your life, you look at the circumstances that you found yourselves in and you feel trapped. Right? You feel like there's no hope. And it feels like there's no way out. You can't see a way through this. And what this understanding does is it guards us from that kind of despair. Not that we never find ourselves in those moments, because we do, but it gives us the ability to have hope in the midst of them, because we can know, as we remember who's writing the story, that there are always better days ahead. That there are always better days ahead, because God is the one who is putting our stories together. And so that hope guards us from despair. And now that's not to say that everything will always work out perfectly in exactly the way that we want it to, because experience tells us that they won't. Right? And we see that even in this passage, as Peter is delivered, but James is not. James was killed, and that was his story. And I think part of the struggle of this life, especially as we age, is coming to terms with the story that God has given us. Is coming to terms with the life that God has given us. Because I think if we're honest, sometimes we find ourselves very disappointed with the life that God has given us. And sometimes that can lead us to a place of bitterness. Sometimes that can lead us to a place of envy. And And it's not an easy thing to wrestle with as we begin to look at our lives and to realize that so many of the expectations that we had for our lives may never come to fruition. Right? That we may never marry. That we may never have kids. And that all of the visions of grandeur that we had for our life, they may go unfulfilled. And it's not an easy thing to process through all of that, right? The disappointments that we go through. But I think what's happening a lot of times, partly at least, on a heart level in the midst of this kind of struggle is that to some degree we're forgetting who's writing the story. Right? And that God is writing our story not for our misery, but for our joy. And that he's woven the pieces together in such a way to bring us joy, and that so many of the pieces of our life are there as gifts from him to us. And it's not always easy to come to terms with the life that God has given us versus the life that we wanted him to. But when we remember who's writing the story, the character and the nature and the love that exists in the heart of the one who is writing the story for us, it helps us to embrace what God has for us. As we remember, and as that remembrance leads us to a place of joy in our relationship with God. And I think that's what this is supposed to impress upon us. All right, but there's still one piece of this that the story has yet to draw out. And so it's for that I want to move into the third and final point now, a judgment. A judgment. So Peter has escaped and fled the city, right? He's gone. Then the morning light comes and the discovery of his absence is made. And as you can imagine, there's quite a disturbance that follows. And so we'll pick this up in verse 18. Now when day came, there was no little disturbance among the soldiers over what had become of Peter. And after Herod searched for him and did not find him, he examined the sentries and ordered that they should be put to death. Then he went down from Judea to Caesarea and spent time there. All right, so morning light comes, and with it the discovery of Peter's absence and the confusion that surrounds that. And there's a bit of a panic that ensues among the guards because, for one, they understand what's at stake, but then also they don't understand what happened, right? How did this guy escape? There's no possibility. We don't understand. But then they know what consequences are coming down the road because of this. And that's what leads to the panic and the disturbance. Because Herod, after failing to find Peter himself, he questions the guards who were responsible and comes to the determination that either they're traitors who let Peter go, or they're just complete failures at their job. But either way, they deserve to die. And so he orders for their execution. And then it has this note about him going down to Caesarea, like he orders the death of these soldiers and then goes on some vacation. It's basically the way that it puts it. And what this is trying to stress here is this action on Herod's behalf. It reveals something about his heart and about his mind, right? That consistently throughout this chapter, he has acted as one who is very comfortable wielding the power of life and death over others. That he is remarkably comfortable making decisions that have to do with who gets to live and who gets to die. Right? As he kills James on a whim, we're not even given the reason why, but when he sees that gains him some political favor, he decides to kill Peter as well, even though they've done nothing. Right? He has nothing against them personally. He's just doing some political maneuvering. And if some lives are lost in the process, then that's just the price that has to be paid. Right? And then when the plan goes awry with Peter, and he can't kill him, he decides to put these guards to death in his place. And so throughout the entirety of this story, he's killing people left and right, seemingly on a whim, and he seems untouchable. Right? The one who wields the power of life and death over all in Israel. But little did he know that just as he held that power over all, so did one hold that power over him. Verse 20. Now Herod was angry with the people of Tyre and Sidon, which were two cities along the coast that were just north of Caesarea. And they came to him with one accord. And having persuaded Blastus, the king's chamberlain, they asked for peace, because their country depended on the king's country for food. All right, so he's upset with these two cities of Tyre and Sidon, so much so that he's withholding food from them, and they're starving. And so through a relationship that they have with Blastus, the king's chamberlain, they persuade the king to meet with them so they can appease his anger, and so he'll continue his provision for them. And then, so that the day is set aside for when this meeting is to take place. And then when the day comes, this is what happens. Verse 21. On an appointed day, Herod put on his royal robes, took his seat upon the throne, and delivered an oration to them. And the people were shouting, "The voice of a God and not of a man." Immediately an angel of the Lord struck him down because he did not give God the glory. And he was eaten by worms and breathed his last. But the word of God increased and multiplied. So there's a well-known first century Jewish historian by the name of Josephus, who was in no way a Christian, who wrote a history of the Jewish people, but with a Roman audience in mind. And in his book, The Jewish Antiquities, he records this event, Herod's death. And within it, he describes how on the day that was appointed, Herod shows up in these dazzling silver robes. And as he begins underway with his speech, the people are crying out, calling him a god, and he does not correct them. And it's right in the midst of this situation that he's struck with these horrible stomach pains. And he has to be brought to his bed. And then for 5 days, he's laying there writhing in pain until finally he breathes his last and he dies. Herod, the one who seemed to hold the power of life and death over everyone in Israel, is brought down in a moment. And his life is brought to a swift and sudden end. And for all of his power and glory, at the end of the day, the thing his story comes to be marked by more than anything is judgment. Right? Even in a Jewish Roman historical source from the first century, not even scripture, his story is marked by judgment. And there are particulars to his life and to his story that we could kind of explore further that would give some explanation as to why. But what I really want to draw from this, from Herod's story, is why it should lead us to a place of gratitude. Why it should lead us to a place of gratitude. And I know the connection there might not make a ton of sense at first, why a story of judgment like this should lead us to gratitude, but let me just show us why. Because throughout the story, Luke has detailed Herod's actions in such a way that by the time he gets what's coming to him, we don't feel sorry for him. Right? The one who was killing people on a whim finally gets a taste of his own medicine, right? He gets what he deserves in this judgment. But the thing is, what's implicit in that interpretation or in our judgment of him in that is that Herod got what he deserved, but we deserve something else. Right? We don't deserve that. We deserve something different, something better, because we're not like Herod. When the truth is, Herod's story is intended to function as a picture of what we all deserve. It's what we all deserve, because if we were to get what we deserve from God, if that's what we were to receive, then every one of our stories would end with the exact same thing as his did, with judgment. Because the truth is, we're no better. And what that leads us to understand is that it's only because of Jesus. It is only because of Jesus that we even have the opportunity to live a story that's marked not by judgment, but by joy. As we see that consistently through the entirety of his life, he followed the story that his Father laid out for him. He walked in obedience to that, even to the point of death, of giving his life upon the cross for us, taking our judgment upon himself, so that we could have the opportunity to live our lives in such a way that is marked not by judgment, but by joy, as we recognize the presence and the reality of an author in our lives, and as we remember who's writing the story, we are only able to do that because Jesus gave his life for us. That's the only way. And that should lead us to gratitude. It should lead us to gratitude because it's because of that we're able to take every good moment and understand it as a gift from our God and as an avenue for connecting with him. Right? And we're able to take even the difficult pieces of life and understand how we can persevere through them with strength and how we can look forward with hope to the better days that are ahead, even when we find ourselves in a circumstance that feels hopeless. Right? And it's all because of Jesus that our stories can be marked not by judgment, but by joy as we recognize the presence and the reality of an author in our lives, and as we remember exactly who's writing the story. And so my hope for us today is that you'll walk away remembering. Let's pray together. Jesus, we thank you. We thank you that you followed the story that was laid out for you, and that as a result of that, the word of God went on to increase and multiply in incredible ways, and we were given the opportunity to know who the author of our stories is, and to walk in those stories with joy and with hope and in obedience. And we thank you and we praise you for that, and we ask that you continue to be with us as we go throughout our day. In Jesus' name, amen.